This video is part of our second series of video presentations about the Book of Mormon. Because the prophet Joseph Smith taught the early church leaders that the Lehigh colony landed in South America, we have created this series of videos. Our theories and research is based on the truths from the Book of Mormon, but should not be considered as official church doctrine. Ancient Towers of the City of Cusco, Peru, the City of Nephi, Part 2, by L. Norman Shurtleff. Pizarro and the Spaniards. When Hernando de Soto and Pedro del Barco, another Spanish conquistador, were part of an advance group of Francisco Pizarro's army, first viewed the city of Cusco from afar off. In the early evening, they saw the temple of Coricancha glistening with the setting sun rays. The astonished soldiers knew that they had finally found their golden city, the El Dorado, that they had been searching for. Pizarro entered the Inca capital on November 15, 1533, and immediately took control of the city of approximately 300,000 people without any resistance. The conquerors and the temple with its high tower. They were impressed with the fortress of Saskatchewan and its tower. In the end, they were mostly impressed with the huge quantities of gold and silver treasure. Garcialo de la Vega said of the tower at the temple, "This was a sort of large tower, which I recall having seen in my youth. The walls were about 12 feet in height, but the roof was so high that the whole thing stood above all the towers that I had ever before seen in Spain, except the one in Seville. On the very topmost point of the roof, instead of a weather vane, for the Indians were not curious about the direction of the wind, there was a tall, sturdy spire, which added greatly to its grace and upward surge. The inside height from the ground to the top of the roof was more than 60 feet. It was called Santurhachi, which means remarkable house, for it stood out alone from the line of the houses, none of which touched it. They viewed the massive walls of the fortress and its huge andesite stones, estimated to weigh between 100 and 400 tons, and fitted and carved so precisely that they have been able to withstand the centuries and several major earthquakes with no apparent damage. No mortar was used to bond them together, and yet a knife blade could not be inserted between them. The Spanish conquistadors were so impressed with this fortress that they could not believe that it was constructed by human hand. The towers of Saskatchewan. On top of the Saskatchewan fortress, there stands the remains of 3 huge towers. These towers were used strategically for defense as lookout towers, but had also a religious function as well. These towers were still present and functional during the Spanish colonial era. Many Spanish chroniclers commented on the impressive height of the towers as being taller than any in Spain. Over the centuries, the stones have been stolen from the towers, and only the foundations remain and are protected in our modern day by the national government. The nobility or kings with their priests lived and used the towers and associated buildings and rooms for ceremonial and religious rites that were handed down through the centuries and used by each succeeding Inca king. These towers and the Saskatchewan fortress itself was connected to the underground passageway that led to Cusco and the temple of Coricancha. Pizarro's entrance into the center of the city of Cusco. William H. Prescott, in his book The Conquest of Peru, wrote about the towers. The Spanish commander Francisco Pizarro rode directly up the great square. It was surrounded by low piles of buildings, among which were several palaces of the Incas. One of these, erected by Huayna Capac, was surmounted by a tower, while the ground floor was occupied by one or more immense halls, like those described in Cajamarca, where the Peruvian nobles held their fetes in stormy weather. Towers on top of the fortress. The most important building was the fortress, planted on a solid rock that rose boldly over the city. It was built of hewn stones, so finely wrought that it was impossible to detect the line or junction between the block, and the approaches to it were defended by 3 semicircular parapets, composed of such heavy masses of rock that it bore resemblance to the kind of work known to architects as cyclopean. The fortress was raised to a height rare in Peruvian architecture, and from the summit of the tower the eye of the spectator ranged over a magnificent prospect in which the wild features of the mountain scenery, rocks, woods, and waterfalls were mingled with the rich verdure of the valley. and the shining city filling up the foreground, all blended in sweet harmony under the deep azure of a tropical sky. The fortress, which overlooked the northern section of the city, stood high on a rocky eminence, so steep as to be inaccessible on this quarter. Where it was defended only by a single wall toward the open country, it was more easy of approach, but there it was protected by three semicircular walls, each about 1,200 feet in length and of great thickness. They were built of massive stones, or rather rocks, put together without cement, so as to form a kind of rustic work. The level of the ground between the lines of defense was raised up so as to enable the garrison to discharge their arrows at the assailants, while their own persons were protected by the parapet. Within the interior wall was the fortress, consisting of three strong towers, one of great height, which, with a smaller one, was now held by the enemy under the command of an Inca noble, a warrior of well-tried valor, prepared to defend it to the last extremity. Description of the towers by Graciela de la Vega is included here, and I quote, "Inside this triple enclosure, three tall towers were erected on a large narrow ground. The largest of them was called Mayak Marca, which means the round tower. It was built over a clear, abundant spring, fed by underground canalizations, concerning which nobody knew from where or how they came. The Inca and members of his Supreme Council were always the only ones who knew such secrets as these. This round tower contained rooms with gold and silver paneled walls, on which animals, birds, and plants figured in relief, as though in a tapestry. It was here that the king lived when he came for rest in the fortress, and as much tableware and other service articles of all kinds were kept there as in the other royal dwelling. The other two towers, which were round but not square in shape, were called Pakar Marca and Salak Marca, and were used to house the soldiers of the garrison. An underground network of passages, which was as vast as the towers themselves, connected them with one another. This was composed of a quantity of streets and alleyways which ran in every direction, and so many doors, all of them identical, that the most experienced men dared not venture into this labyrinth without a guide, consisting of a long thread tied to the first door, which unwound as they advanced." Unquote. These three great fortified towers in this position was described by the historian Graciela de la Vega in 1560. These towers, which bear the names of Muyu Marca and Sala Marca and Pakar Marca, dominate the site of the fortress of Saskatchewan. Only the base of these magnificent structures is still seen. The first tower was cylindrical in shape, on a rectangular base. The base of Salamarca Tower consists of a rectangular measuring 71 feet by 6 inches by 33 feet 6 inches wide, but the Pakar Marca Tower is entirely in ruins, and only traces of it are to be seen. Our video shows that the whole fortress belongs to the Inca period and earlier civilizations. These towers were even taller than the great medieval towers in Spain. The Tower of Gold in Seville is shown here in this picture. Here is the watchtower in Madrid, and the magnificent tower of the castle of Baytry. Ancient towers have always been a defining characteristic of the city of Nephi. They were built for lookouts, for protection, and for the prophets of God to use to preach to his people. And even today, they have a way of making our eyes look upward into heaven. Our temples today are like the ancient towers of Peru. The spires make us look upward into heaven.